Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a college coach conversation. I feel like I haven't been here in forever. It's probably only been a couple of weeks, but I miss you guys when I'm not hosting. Just a quick note, I have started mentioning this at the opening of many of our podcasts, which is if you like this podcast, if you find it really helpful, it would be really helpful to us if you would go to Apple Podcasts and post a review for us. That's going to help other people find us as well. The more reviews we have, the easier it is for people to find us. So please consider it. Today, we're going to be answering your questions. But before we get to that, we actually have a really interesting opportunity today to hear about last season's admission cycle, which, as you all recall, was smack in the middle of probably one of the most intense times of the COVID pandemic that we've had so far. My fondest hope is that it stands as the most intense time we've had in COVID, and that everything from here on out is a little bit less marred by COVID, but I guess that remains to be seen. And joining me today is my colleague here at College Coach, Gabby Tobias, who joined our team directly from the admissions office at High Point University. So at this time last year, she was reading files and making admissions decisions. So she's going to share her insight. Hi, Gabby.
Hi, Beth. Thank you for having me. I'm
Uh,
happy to join.
Absolutely. Well, we're thrilled to have you here. And I think, last year was obviously incredibly stressful time for everyone, regardless of whether you were applying to college or not. But if you were applying to college, I think the stress really was increased
Yes,
tremendously, right?
right.
Um, and a lot of things changed. We had a lot of schools that previously had required test scores go test optional. We had students in activities that were canceled or postponed. We had grades that or classes where instead of getting a grade, you were getting pass fail scores. So it really threw everything into upheaval. And so um, I thought it would be really helpful to get your perspective on what you saw as an admissions officer during this time. Um, and I think the first place I want to start is a place where we're getting a lot of questions regularly, and that is with test scores. And I was
Yeah.
curious, if you saw a lot of students taking advantage of the test optional policy that High Point was have. So why don't we start with that small question? Did a lot of students submit without scores?
Yeah, so we were in a different situation when it came to that because previously High Point was test optional before the pandemic, which is
Got it.
awesome.
Yeah.
But so I think about before the pandemic, about 40% or so students, don't directly quote me on that, apply test optional.
Right.
And then during the pandemic, it ramped up to about 70 or so percent.
Wow.
So a really big jump. So to answer your question, yes, we did see a lot of students taking advantage of those test optional policies, especially the region where I recruited, where I was based in Southern California. So
Yeah.
a lot of students couldn't test at all, where I'm at. So if not, most of my applications coming through were students who were submitting and applying test optional. So
Got it. Got it. So to your point, you were working at a university that already had a test optional policy, and kudos High Point for that policy. We like test optional here.
yes.
So my guess is, well, I would love to get some insight or to share some insight with our listeners in terms of, do you review the applications that come in without scores differently than the ones that came in with scores? How does that process work for the students who are opting not to submit scores?
Yeah, so for the students who are opting not to submit scores, I think we're looking a little bit more closely at their academic trajectory. So looking a little bit more at their progress from those 9th through 11th grade years, and kind of that grade trend is what you're hearing most of that. So maybe if you had a rocky start 9th grade year, how did you pick that up from 10th through 11th grade year? Or maybe on the opposite end, if you didn't, how did you challenge yourself? What types of courses did you take? Really looking closely at those students who maybe didn't submit test scores, but are still taking those rigorous kind of courses, and how successful were they within those courses as well, too.
Hmm.
I think also we leaned a lot on the qualitative features of the applicant. So, their essay, their letters of recommendation, also some of their extracurricular activities as well too, to kind of show a little bit more of their academic side. So if they did any activities that related to what they wanted to study, that was kind of something that I looked at to see how prepared were they for that course of study going into a college setting. So I think it kind of helped a little bit more. COVID really kind of helped expose that, to see that a really big indicator for success was how students performed in the classroom,
Right.
versus for 3 hours on a Saturday or
Yes.
Sunday evening or whatever. I can't remember right now, but
Right.
I think that was kind of really a great thing that we saw is, how are these students performing day-to-day basis? How consistent are they in the classroom? So
Right. And as you point out, right, that's a much bigger indicator of success in college. And I think all of these schools that have adopted test optional policies prior to COVID, right? So
mhm,
policies that weren't dictated by the virus were recognizing if they had recently instituted these policies or if they were longstanding. One of the things that we hear over and over again is that the colleges saw that the biggest correlation was not between your test score and how you did and when you
right,
got to college, but how you'd done in high school. So
right,
I think it's helpful insight. I hope it's helpful insight to our listeners to understand that when you take away the test piece, all it really does is throw more emphasis on the other pieces. So if those are great and the test piece is not great, awesome, right?
yeah,
If those are not so great and the tests are not so great, well, I don't know that taking away the test helps you at all, but not having test scores as part of that policy for those kinds of schools with the holistic approach that a place like
right,
High Point has, right, um,
absolutely.
is typically not going to present any kind of a problem. As we've mentioned on the show in the past, that certainly there are schools where, your bigger schools where their decision is almost exclusively based on your grades and your test scores. Well, when you remove test scores, it might be a little bit more problematic. They don't necessarily
Mhm.
have the staff to read super closely. But again, if they've gone test optional, they figured out a way to do it. And so if you really can't test or your scores are not reflective of your abilities, then I think again will encourage and encourage again and again and again, don't submit those scores. So,
Right. Absolutely.
all right. So in terms of, one of the big things that COVID also impacted were extracurricular activities. So I was curious how you handled that when you were reviewing applications, right? So students who may have been very involved or even a little involved prior to the pandemic and now were not really able to do much of anything because everything had been canceled. How did that impact how you read those files?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think for me, because a lot of the applications that I read were students who had a couple years under their belt prior to COVID.
Mhm.
So I think for that, that's really kind of where I leaned a little bit more heavily on is what were they doing their ninth and their 10th, and for some, maybe a little bit more of those 11th grade years,
Mhm.
and kind of how are they able to kind of jumpstart their high school career, and what were some of those activities that they were involved in prior. I think I also had some students, and we saw students get really creative also during COVID, and they were
Mhm.
able to do a lot of virtual opportunities that maybe they had planned on doing. And then I also encourage students talk about those activities, and talk about those extracurricular activities that you planned on being a part of, but maybe you're not able to, and kind of talk about what your role was going to be in that as well too. So I really relied heavily on some of the previous years. And I think it was also great because I interviewed a lot of my applicants beforehand. So I was kind of able to see who they were and kind of how involved they were in their school through those interviews. I know not every student has that opportunity with the schools that they're applying to, but
Mhm.
that's kind of why I stress for students is interview. If the school is offering an interview, especially now during COVID when they're not readily able to go to your school, you're not readily able to visit campus. Talk to them and just kind of tell your story, and talk about some of the things that you're interested in doing, and some of the things that you're currently involved in doing during COVID, and how creative you were able to get there. So I also relied a lot heavily on some interviews and kind of some face-to-face virtual time as well too.
Right. And for those schools that aren't interviewing, what I do like is you're pointing out that you were looking at what they had started to do. So
Mhm.
not ideal for the student who maybe didn't get involved right away and was sort of waiting on that. So for those of you who
Right.
are younger and listening to this, you got to start right at the
Yeah.
beginning. But I know even when my son was filling out applications this year, that there were a couple of places where he has said, intended to be involved or this was canceled for,
Mhm.
11th grade to explain why. Not that I think the colleges more or less get why he would be involved in something in ninth and 10th, not in 11th, but picking it back up in 12th. I think that's the other thing too, right? Everybody is experiencing COVID.
Right.
Everybody has experienced delays. So it's so tempting to be so in your box that all you could think about is what they won't know about your child or what they won't know about me if you're the one who's applying. But remembering that this has impacted everyone and the colleges, including your admissions officers, and they get it. They know this is having a big impact. So I think really helpful insight
Yeah.
there. Um, so in the college, in the application, certainly in the common application and in other applications, they may offer students this opportunity. There is a question asking about how COVID impacted you and your life. And I'm curious if you felt like students took advantage of that question appropriately. And by that, I mean, did you get responses that were really you didn't need, or did people not fill it out that you think should have? I just love your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think majority of the students, so I'll say, let's say 70-30. 70% majority of the students who took advantage of that section did it well, and they talked about it to create a little bit more context of their personal situation or their academic situation or emotional or mental health or anything like that. And I think that was really great for me as a counselor to kind of step back and see, this student, not only were they successful in the classroom and whatever else they did, but they also had these barriers and these obstacles that they had to face throughout it.
Right.
I did have some students who I did find that they just talked about, being virtual and kind of being online and not really answering the question in a sense of talking about an obstacle and barrier, where it kind of, to your point of what you said previously, we're all kind of experiencing it and we're all virtual and online. And, I'm aware that you do have virtual school now. Let's talk about some other things that's going to help create a little bit more context and dive a little bit more into your situation. Right. So I would say majority, yes, but then you did have some of those few, which I still appreciated those because, they answered it and that was something that they felt like they had to kind of share with us. And I appreciate that. But I would say majority did it correctly. And they kind of talked about some of those personal situations.
And if they didn't respond to that question, that was, I'm guessing, not an issue, but I'd love your thoughts.
No, it wasn't an issue at all. I think I encouraged students to use that space however they felt they wanted to use it. And some students felt like they were lucky and they were privileged and they were blessed to not have any interruptions. And I think that's great. If don't fill it out just to fill it out and just to kind of check that box in a sense, fill it out if something really intentionally happened to you. I don't think that was anything at all that was held against them or something that I felt that was negative at all in any type of way. I'm always a component for using the additional information section on the application in general, just so I can have a little bit more context about who you are as a student if anything happened. But regardless, I said, it's up to you to talk about whatever you want. So.
Right. And my advice to my students has been routinely, if you don't have something more than just, well, I was virtual and this, then, I would leave it blank because to your point, that experience is something that is shared. I had a student who was talking about how his parents were first responders, but the things which I think I get as a big deal, but the way that his life had changed was so minimal. In the way that he described it, I said, I'm not, to me, I don't think this is going to add anything to your application. And he ultimately opted not to send it. And that didn't hurt him at all. So I do think it's key that you have something specific that you want to share that goes beyond what everybody is experiencing. And that if you don't fill it out, that's not a problem. So I think good advice there. All right. We have two more things that I wanted to talk about. And one is, obviously most campuses were closed to students in terms of doing visits, and most people were not really eager to drive all over and go to see college campuses anyway. Or if they were, if it wasn't open to you, that was a lot less appealing. Was it a problem from an admissions perspective that students hadn't visited your campus?
So I think yes and no. I think really when it came to that, we presented so many other options and opportunities, and where students could do it.
Mhm.
So it kind of opened up the door and kind of opened up the access for students who maybe they couldn't readily get on a plane or get in a car and visit our campus. Then they could do a virtual information session, or they can come to my virtual campus visit or an interview. So we had a couple different touch points that students can kind of take advantage of. I
Mhm.
think that was kind of really where I was focusing on, is how did you take advantage of those, and
Yes.
did you take advantage of those, is the key thing. And, if I reached out to you several times for an interview, did you respond back? Those types of things that we're kind of looking at in regards to just demonstrated interest in total. So I
Mhm.
think it was a little bit more easier for students. I think the problem that came with some students not visiting campuses is I had a lot of students, especially with me being in California and High Point being in North Carolina, who had to make the decision sight unseen.
Yeah, that's hard.
So that was hard, right?
Yeah.
So I was worried from just a counselor perspective that, I hope this is, their choice, and that they're making a good choice, and, that they feel like it is going to be somewhere that they can call home for 4 or so years.
Yep.
But I think that was kind of the only no to that, or the only yes portion of that I saw the problem was students just kind of making decisions in a sense blindly.
Yes.
But I think we did a good job at making sure every student had access to visiting campus, whether that was virtual or in person in some sort of way. So,
Right. And I think that is a really good point, which is that physically setting foot on campus was less important from an admissions perspective, but engaging with you, since you presented
yeah.
so many options, is important. And so I say this to my students all the time. I will say this to our listeners. If the school is offering you ways to engage with them, take advantage of those.
Yes.
They may not always be part of their admissions process, but there is a likelihood, especially again when you're talking about smaller schools, private schools, that they are going to be tracking your engagement with the
Mhm.
institution. And so you want to take advantage. Very quickly, as we come up on our time, Gabby, any last pieces of advice for students who are applying this year, who obviously have experienced disruptions from COVID?
Yeah, I think focus on the things that you can control right now.
Yep.
I think a lot of times students and parents, and I understand, and I hear you guys, because we've had so much downtime and everybody feels like they're behind in
Yes.
life and just in general, but focus on those opportunities and those experiences that you can control in the application process, and don't stress yourself out on some of those things that you can't control.
Yeah.
Right. And really utilize some of those qualitative features. If you are applying test optional and that's something that you're maybe not as confident or you're a little bit more nervous about, making sure that you're maximizing your activity list, your essays, that you're reaching out to student teachers, getting those letters of recommendation, and making sure that they're adequately talking about who you are as a student. I think that's kind of the bigger picture, is tell your story and advocate for yourself in a way that's going to be authentic and engaging. But I think that's just really my biggest thing, is just focus on what you can control right now. And then the rest, I promise, will fall into place after
Yes.
that. So
great advice, Gabby. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right. We are going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're answering your questions. So don't go away.